The issue of slavery of people of African origin and descent in the United States did not begin and end during the years 1861 to 1865. Enslavement in the United States began in 1619, was hotly debated during the founding of the country, and continued to spark until the explosion of the Civil War. After the war, the resulting fallout is still being felt to this day. The irony of all this is reflected at Monticello, almost more than other antebellum Southern house or plantation. I'm the NYC Traveler, and we're at President Thomas Jefferson's house in Virginia. Thomas Jefferson, Monticello's owner, wrote the document that officially separated the United States from England as a colony. The Declaration of Independence originally contained clauses condemning slavery, even though Jefferson himself owned slaves. The clause was removed at the insistence of Southern states whose economy depended on the free enslaved labor. South Carolina finally gave approval of the document, and other Southern states followed suit, and Congress finally voted for independence. After writing the Declaration in 1776, he proposed in the Virginia Constitution that no person coming into the country after the Constitution would be held in slavery. That proposal was not adopted. However, banning new imports was adopted in 1778, with all Southern states ultimately adopting similar measurements except South Carolina, which ultimately had to do so when Congress passed banning importation in 1807. In 1780, the Secretary of the French delegation in Philadelphia posed a series of questions to each of the 13 states, and Jefferson wrote his response about Virginia. The answers eventually became his book, Notes on the State of Virginia, and there were references about slavery within answers to certain topics. Jefferson wrote of the possibility of an actual race war, which, quote, will probably never end, but in the extermination of one or the other race, end quote. Ironically, extermination did not happen with people of African descent, but rather almost with the indigenous peoples of the United States. Jefferson's worries about violence with abolition and emancipation probably came from uprisings in Haiti and smaller ones in the United States. He embraced the idea of colonization, sending free blacks back to Africa. He admirably stated that slavery was demoralizing to both blacks and whites, but sadly wrote that he believed that blacks were inferior in many ways. In January 1781, while Jefferson was governor of Virginia, he and the Virginia Assembly members fled Richmond, leaving behind his enslaved servants who were taken prisoner. The servants were later released in exchange for British war prisoners held by the Americans. Later, in June 1781, there was a threat that Jefferson and his family were about to be captured by the British at Monticello. They fled again, leaving their enslaved servants behind to protect the property. The British did not harm any of the enslaved persons left behind, nor did they loot the property. Jefferson's thinking regarding slavery and how he perceived African Americans mirrored the philosophy of the day. Very confusing. He left conflicting thoughts, condemning slavery sometimes, calling for its abolition, while facing the fact that he could not profit from the entire Monticello operations without it. And like many people of his day, while he understood the basic system was based on something that was wrong and that humans should not be owned, it did not alter what he thought of the intelligence and nature of black people, that they were basically inferior. And like other people of the era, he wondered if blacks and whites could live side by side once slavery ended. It turns out that Jefferson and his peers were actually correct in that slavery could not last forever in the United States. It would be violent when it did end, and there would be friction, to say the very least, in the aftermath. So, Jefferson appeared to support eventual abolition and the emancipation of enslaved persons, and he did free the children of Sally Hemings in his will, but most of his enslaved servants were not freed during his lifetime. Most of the information at Monticello indicates that the enslaved persons during Jefferson's lifetime were most likely American-born, several generations removed from the imported slave trade. Jefferson inherited some of his laborers, but most of the others were part of the dowry that came with his wife, the widow Martha Wales Skelton, through her first husband and through her father. The Monticello Enslaved Community Database has 609 records of persons who labored at the farms, though they weren't all there at once throughout Jefferson's years, of course. Despite his feelings toward slavery and toward enslaved labor as people, the main reason Jefferson did not emancipate his slaves during his lifetime was debt. He inherited his father's and his father-in-law's problems and racked up his own debt. Likewise, his daughter, Martha Jefferson Randolph, endured the same with her husband, her father-in-law, and her own father, Thomas Jefferson's debts. She put the estate up for sale, land, house, and people, about 2 weeks after his death, residing with her married children, living off money donated by some states in her father's memory, and hiring out her few remaining enslaved servants to earn money. Ironically, the main reason for holding on to the plantation and the enslaved persons was to try to clear the debt and to make money, and that was the reason why it had to be sold. It was sold to James Turner Barclay, who sold it to Uriah Levy. It stayed in the Levy family until 1923, when the Thomas Jefferson Foundation acquired Monticello. It is very possible that because Monticello had so few owners and that the house survived physically being intact during the Revolutionary War and after the Civil War is the reason why we know more about enslaved persons here than at so many other Southern plantations. The Thomas Jefferson Foundation, owners and operators of Monticello, acknowledging the entire history of Monticello, including the legacy of slavery, expanded their exhibits in Monticello. We first visited in 2008, and when we returned in 2022, we could see the difference in all of the exhibits, including more information not only about the Jefferson family and the house, but the enslaved families. In addition to American history, there is information about the life of enslaved people of African American descent. Archaeology, architecture, artifacts of the museum are there as well. Furniture, clothing, utensils, and everything else. If you like gardening, this is the place to come as well. It was very impressive to find information about the enslaved families with first and last names because many plantations don't have history like this. In our next video, we will meet some of these families. I'm the NYC Traveler, and we've been at Monticello in Virginia.